This is the final part of the Dungeons & Dragons Iceberg Explained, and excitingly, where we get the best entries. The last video finished halfway through the middle of the iceberg, so I'll pick back up where we left off. Please don't forget to subscribe. This is still a new channel and all of your support is appreciated. At the end, I'll have a few words to say on what comes next for the channel, so please watch through to hear about my plans and hear how you can get involved too. The Dread Gazebo. Kicking off with a classic, the tale of Eric and the Dread Gazebo was published in physical press, Alarums and Excursions by Richard Aronson. The article tells the story of Ed Whitchurch DMing for a player named Eric Sorensen. Eric is described as a precise and efficient gamer who, after being told by the DM that a gazebo is sitting on a hill, asks its colour, size, tries to detect alignment, then attacks it. Once it was clear he could not do any damage, he runs away in fear. Eric likely thought the gazebo was a Glabrezu, one of the earliest demons found in D&D. If anyone's in any doubt, this is a gazebo. There is some question to the veracity of this story. It's very similar to a story in Don Quixote, where Don Quixote sees giants in the distance and, not one to shy away from adventure, charges towards them, finds himself unable to fight them, then rationalises that a magician must be hiding their form to Sancho Panza, who has from the start seen that they were, in fact, windmills. Whether the Dread Gazebo was inspired by Don Quixote is itself a question Cervantes would have loved to play with, as he writes in the sequel to Don Quixote, though part of the same book we read today, of an impostor. A false Don Quixote, who roamed the countryside and pretended to be Don Quixote, which is a reference to a false sequel to the novel that was written before Cervantes could finish the real sequel. An impostor stealing one of Don Quixote's achievements will be fertile ground for a deeper, more confusing reference. The stolen adventure from a fictional adventurer who himself had a canonical impostor pretending to be the adventurer himself, which itself was based on a real false sequel of the adventurer's adventure. The head spins, much like the windmill. Modron Court. Modrons are a race in D&D who place supreme emphasis on following the principles of law and order in all situations. They are lawful neutral creatures, as you might imagine, and are in fact the embodiment of the universal principle of order. Modrons have a strict hierarchical structure in their society, which is also reflected in their physiology. Monodrons, at the lowest level of society, are geometric shapes, and the more sides they have, the higher their rank. The highest ranking Modrons are humanoid in shape. Monodrons are the most basic, then duodrones, tridrones, quadrones, and pentadrones. Beyond these base castes, there are hierarchs starting with decatons, moving all the way to Tertian and Secundus, all under their ruler, Primus. Each Modron will follow all orders given to it by a Modron one rank higher. It will also follow orders from those of higher ranks, though they cannot psychologically process higher ranks, so a tridrone, receiving an order from a pentadrone, would think that it was a very powerful quadrone instead. Strangers trying to navigate the bureaucracy of the Modrons would find themselves having to appear multiple times before clerks, courts, and boards. This entry, I suspect, is in reference to the parallels between Modron courts and Joseph K's bureaucratic nightmare in Franz Kafka's novel The Trial. In it, Joseph is arrested and prosecuted for a crime which is not specified and never made clear throughout the novel. Joseph makes consistent efforts to find out his crime and is summoned to a court without being given an exact time or even room. Upon finding the room in the attic, he is chastised for being late. Throughout the story, Joseph meets other accused, meets with other clerks for advice, though they have no power over the situation either, and fundamentally cannot get anywhere. This would not be quite the same as Modron Court, as they do follow procedure strictly, though the absurdity of multiple courts and being forced to appear and reappear is not dissimilar to the bureaucratic hell that Joseph faced. Half-orca. I'm sure that at some point this has been the name of some female orc hero of a campaign. Let's not forget adding an A feminises all. Except, in this case, orcas are an actual thing. Here is a half-orca. The race itself seems to be the half-orca, rather than a specific cross of a separate orca whale race and humans, though please don't ask how this race came into being. This is a family-friendly channel. Al-Qadim. Al-Qadim is a campaign setting based loosely on the folktales from the Middle Eastern 1001 Nights. Originally, it was supposed to have quite a limited run, with only a 2-year plan for content. However, material was released later for 3.5e, having initially been released under AD&D. The setting, as you might expect, has strong similarities to real Middle Eastern cultures and histories, with approximations for both their language, Madani to Arabic, religion, a pastiche of Islam, and political structures, e.g. a ruling caliph, as well as ways of life, nomadic / city life. Because the focus of the setting is to have a Middle Eastern feel, the predominant races are human, human-like creatures, or half-human creatures, with fate being a constant principle. The setting was eventually incorporated into the southern part of Toril in the Forgotten Realm setting. Whilst not quite as cringe-inducing culturally for me personally as Oriental Adventures, this setting does fall into the pitfalls of generalising cultures and peoples, including the prevalence of Western tropes of the Middle East, such as honour killings, which leads to misrepresentation and over-representation of certain views, which can be harmful. As before, attitudes to how cultural material should be handled have changed since the setting's release, and I'm sure intentions were good. However, we can certainly see the problems with it today. Fantasy can be a good excuse for exploring hypothetical cultures which do have distinct elements which aren't pleasant, but when it's such a close approximation to something real, the fantasy argument does feel a bit hollow. Burke. This is an example of slang in a specific setting, specifically planar slang from the planar cant of the Planescape setting, especially prevalent within the sigil. Burke means a fool or loser, especially one who got himself into a mess when he should have known better. This one was hard for me to identify, because frankly, Burke is slang in British, and means pretty much the same thing, so I did have to get M. Christopher, the creator of this Iceberg, to clarify. In real life, it originates from Cockney rhyming slang, though it's used quite widely I'd say. However, it's definitely not the most prominent insult you hear. It's quite light-hearted, but to be honest, even the worst words in English can be endearing with the right tone. The word daft before anything helps towards that end as well. Satan. Satan existed in the AD&D 1st edition, though he was explicitly excluded from the 2nd edition as a result of the Satanic Panic. Satan, in lore, briefly ruled the Nine Hells, though was usurped by Beelzebub, after Belial was the only archdevil to side with him in a contention to his rule, and both ended up exiled. Beelzebub himself was later usurped by Asmodeus, and Asmodeus removed almost all references to Satan and Lucifer from their history. Satan is mentioned in the Book of Vile Darkness in the 3rd edition, though to my knowledge there have not been many, if any, references to Satan since then. The reason for this is of course no longer due to the Satanic Panic, but rather, according to some sources, because of a combination of generally avoiding close reference to real-world religions, but also because in the system there is not much space for Satan when Asmodeus is the most powerful archdevil. Oglaf. Oglaf was, according to the creator, originally supposed to be a form of D&D based drawn porn, but quickly transformed into sex-based comedy. I won't claim to be a viewer, or maybe I'm just not admitting it. However, upon my quick browse of the site, there seem to be classics such as Cut Sprite and Pink Eye. Definitely not suitable for under 18s, and think I might be scarred. Dragon and Dungeon magazine. I appreciated M. Christopher mentioning Dragon magazine before Dungeon magazine in this entry, as I'd likely have spent an hour trying to research a non-existent Dungeon and Dragon magazine. All the cool kids clearly check their syntax. Ambiguity is for Burks. Both magazines are official TSR or WOTC products, obviously depending on the current D&D publisher at that specific point in time. Dragon magazine was first printed in 1976 as a follow-up to TSR's earlier publication, the Strategic Review. The magazine is what you might expect from a D&D magazine, containing content and articles on topics ranging from supplementary material and stories to discussions on metagaming and deep dives on monsters. Being an official product gave it an element of freedom to add lore in a more official capacity than other publications. Dungeon magazine came a little bit later, first being published in 1986, and specifically targeted DMs. The magazine was largely made up of pre-tested and scripted scenarios, as well as adventures and modules for DMs to either use with players directly or adapt for their own campaigns. Both magazines had their final issues released in 2013, prior to the release of 5e. For Dungeon magazine, it's clear that WOTC were planning the release of the Adventurers League Organised Play, which we've already looked at in this Iceberg. In addition, both magazines have been digital only since 2007, so we can assume physical readership was waning prior to the release of 5e. As we know, the accessible game mechanics of 5e drove a resurgence in popularity for D&D, so prior to this, it would not be surprising that this type of media might have had a declining viewership. The release of a new edition is the perfect time to rejuvenate the media on offer, though it's always sad to lose staples of the community. Amy the Owl. This is a great green text where, after a little girl tells Amy that she wants to be an adventurer too, Amy, begins describing the horrors of adventuring in gruesome and inappropriate details, pleading for her not to become an adventurer. This sends the girl into tears and she runs away. However, the story culminates in Ami revealing the real reason to his party, that being to prevent further competition for getting good jobs. An indeed. DMS Guild. DMS Guild is a platform which allows creators to produce D&D content in a way which is supported by Wizards of the Coast. Essentially, creators can produce anything from adventures and scenarios to backgrounds, classes and monsters. These creations are monetised, with the creator receiving 50% of royalties on products sold. DMS Guild is somewhat divisive. Some people dislike it because Wizards of the Coast are taking 50% of all sales on something which they had no hand in producing. Others think this is less of an issue, as it's all based on their intellectual property, and therefore providing any way for the content to be released and monetised is more than is required of them. On balance, if they didn't do this, there would likely be more pirating. The more problematic aspect of DMS Guild is that the creations effectively become the property of Wizards of the Coast if they're sold through this platform, which means the creator is giving up potential creative control and claims of ownership to the material they've spent a long time creating. The alternative is for individuals to do their own marketing and sales on platforms like Kickstarter, though, to avoid any IP or copyright issues, there are a few hoops, declarations and statements to avoid which ensure the material can be monetised, which could be more of a headache and leave a lingering anxiety. I'm sure different creators will have different preferences, and that's probably for the best. Deep Iceberg. At this point of the iceberg, even being a D&D enthusiast probably isn't enough. You need to take D&D seriously and keep track of niche threads of trivia actively. The Luminous Being. The Luminous Being is above all other gods, and in being above other gods and their domains, is above crystal spheres. The Luminous Being is outside time and space, existing eternally and has the qualities of both warmth and cold harshness. Lord Al, the overgod of f.a.t.a.l, needed to report to the Luminous Being as an entity beyond normal cosmology, which indicates that the total power of Win f.a.t.a.l that Lord Al has is below that which the Luminous Being is capable of. Little else is known about the Luminous Being in D&D lore. Unless the DM is the Luminous Being. DMs are beyond the cosmology of D&D, and have complete power over every aspect of the games, including the most powerful gods. They can cross settings and retcon lore if they want to, just because they have that complete control over their games. It's a cool concept to have the most powerful entities in D&D reporting to our DMs. Sequel films. I'd rather talk about The Rise of Skywalker here. To give the shortest acceptable outline that I can, the 2000 Dungeons & Dragons movie had two sequels. Dungeons & Dragons Wrath of the Dragon God, and Dungeons & Dragons The Book of Vile Darkness. Wrath of the Dragon God surrounds an orb linked to the power of the dragon god Balothemog and the pursuit of its power by Damodar. The Book of Vile Darkness tells the story of a man recruited into a knight order to Pelor, but needs to find the Book of Vile Darkness after his entire order and father were killed. That's all you're getting on these films. The Great Mother. The Great Mother is the greater deity responsible for creating beholders. The Great Mother is responsible for creating and birthing beholders, which is why she is considered their mother. The Great Mother looks like a mammoth beholder herself, though her precise features are difficult to pinpoint as her incomprehensible complexity means her form constantly shifts. Beholders have a split psyche, making them borderline insane, so it's probably unsurprising to hear that they remember the Great Mother looking consistent, precisely like them as an individual beholder. Beholders think that the Great Mother thinks like them, nuttily, and whilst from the outside her actions seem consistent with insanity, she is actually very sane and astute, though she is whimsical and impulsive. She is said to be one of the greatest sages on the topic of chaos and evil, though she is like beholders in that she hates lower beings and would never share her knowledge with them. Anything that the Great Mother does not know are things she does not consider to be important. Any beholder she creates, or comes across, that she deems to be offensive or not a reflection of herself, she will destroy or consume. She does help her creations sometimes, though not consistently and not like other deities. Beholders, due to their nature, are rarely priests, though they do all hold her with reverence and awe. It is her attitude of complete superiority which leads to the beholder's self-perception as perfect mortal beings. Ahriman. Thanks to M. Christopher for pointing me to Mr. Rex's video on this topic, linked in the description. I highly recommend watching this video as I'm only giving a brief overview of the topic. In the video, Mr. Rex explores the character of Asmodeus, the Lord of Lies, and notes the lies in his own origin, and how, contrary to the stated origin, Asmodeus himself is Ahriman, one of the twin serpents of lore. Ahriman and Jazarian, the twin serpents, emerged from and worked together on the fundamental order of the universe, including the rule of three, until a disagreement on what should be the centre of reality emerged, heaven or b.a.t.a.l. This tore their auroral unity apart, causing Ahriman's fall to the mortal plane, through the nine hells and producing the serpent's coil at the bottom, wounding him and bounding him by the laws that he himself created, whilst Jazarian was feathered and could fly. His wounds forged Kotal's, whom he uses to gather intelligence on Ahriman. Asmodeus' lies include perpetuating his image as a normal archdevil, and one who is invested in the war between devils and demons. But the reality is that Asmodeus is using this cover to house his real self in the deepest depths of the lowest hell, where only atheists go, where he eats every aspect of those souls to fix his serpentine body's own wounds. Ahriman's final goal is to complete Armageddon. He wants to be free of the laws of the universe that he created, but then fell into and is bound by. That to do so he must recreate the state of initial chaos where he would combine with Jazarian and recreate everything again, though ideally not fall this time, so he can remain above creation. Jazarian, then, is the only entity who knows Asmodeus' true identity. It's worth noting that this lore dates back over 20 years now, so it's probably part of legends in lore. Crystal spheres. A crystal sphere is the outer boundary of any collection of planets whose settings are traversable through normal means. We've already made reference to these in the spelljamming section, where a spelljamming vessel traverses the wild space between different crystal spheres to access distant campaign settings. Each crystal sphere has its own gods, whose sphere of influence is contained within the crystal sphere, and who are forbidden from interfering with gods outside of their own crystal sphere. It is said that this is due to an ancient pact, which is only acceptable to break if another god is attempting to break it. It almost sounds like a D&D version of NATO, with the Mad Doctrine preventing skirmishes into other realms. Crystal spheres come into existence through a process very similar to mitosis, where one sphere starts to grow, a dividing line over time appears, and both continue to grow until they eventually split. The process is said to be very beautiful to watch, even to gods. In addition to this, one way to think of crystal spheres is that every D&D story ever has its own crystal sphere, including homebrew campaigns, and therefore, every possible possibility exists, including other properties. M. Christopher mentioned Marvel, Star Wars, Rick and Morty, etc., which is a very cool concept. I just watched Veritasium's video on parallel worlds, so this mitosis idea of the creation of crystal spheres could also have some headcanon relationship with quantum mechanics, wherein every environmental decoherence results in a split of universes based on separate outcomes. Though this canonical explanation goes a bit further, as it not only includes all possible worlds, but the impossible ones too. Obyriths. Obyriths are an ancient eldritch race whose form was so abhorrent that it could drive mortals insane. In other words, they're Lovecraftian horrors. Lovecraft would no doubt describe their horror as indescribable. Obyriths have existed even longer than the gods themselves, existing for so long that they precede the very laws of the universe that at least make the odd and strange comprehensible, and the incomprehensible too is comprehensible in comparison to them. They're from a different reality, one which, through their dark hunger, they consumed, and have infected our own reality with both their hunger and power. Obyriths have largely been wiped out in number after warring with the Tanari, however a few remain. Some held dominion over small, inhospitable corners of existence. Others formed the Queen's Conclave, or Quorum of 12, which attempted to conquer the Abyss to reinstate Obyrith supremacy. This society was considered to be a myth, or extinct group, however they fought amongst demon lords. Of these, only Dagon, the Prince of the Darkened Depths, and the leader of the cult of Dagon, was openly acknowledged as an Obyrith. The Abyss is of course an evil place, but its original form embodied less of the objective evil it has come to be associated with, and rather embodied a chaotic evil, one which lacked form, and which only Obyrith could adapt to the horrors and survive. Part of the reason it's believed that Obyrith dominion of the Abyss would bring back the Obyrith supremacy is because it's thought that the Obyrith Prince of Demons would bring back the conditions by which Obyrith can emerge from the Abyss. The Henderson scale. The Henderson scale is used to assess how much a given action has affected the plot of an adventure. The scale can indicate an action has impacted the campaign so positively that all plot points, present and future, are resolved in-game. It can indicate that an action has no impact on the plot at all, or, alternatively, the most often used purpose of the scale indicates precisely how much a campaign has been derailed by an action. Its name comes from 1d4chan, and alludes to the story of Old Man Henderson. Old Man Henderson is a character created by a player who was outraged when his DM killed his player character unfairly. Old Man Henderson was specifically designed to be confusing, to hide the fact that skills were being added on the fly, and his sole purpose was to derail the DM's campaign. Old Man Henderson is a munchkin, but a munchkin with purpose. His aim was to win, but not just against other players, but the DM himself. Without spoiling the story, I can tell you that by the end, the DM flipped the table in real life. One full Henderson on the scale equates to total derailment of a campaign. Stalking a normal girl. The original poster of this green text describes taking part in an evil campaign with quite gruesome characters, and explains how the only thing his character does is stalk a young girl. Nothing else, he just stalks her. The rest of the group, rightfully I think, find this deeply unsettling in real life and bring it up. Over time, the group suspect there is no ill content involved, and slowly become fond of the young girl, giving her gifts and looking over her. They eventually stop being able to hide their evil acts, and over time transition their evil campaign into a normal one. When the DM says he suspected that this was the original poster's plan all along, he denies it and stabs the girl in the neck. Brutal. That Guy Destroys Psionics. This story has 2 full Hendersons on 1D4chan to give you an initial insight into the shenanigans of this story. This poster really is a that guy from the start. He's finicky and takes offence to others in the group. He even dislikes the DM and setting, so it's bound to end badly. The story is linked in the description, as are the others I mention, but glossing over a fair few details, after being falsely blamed for attacking the BBEG by another player's character, he takes action which successfully causes psionics to be destroyed in a psionics-based campaign. Though, that obviously gets retconned. He manages to do it again, though the DM overrules it again, but responds by setting an unending army of constructs to beat the BBEG into submission anyway after anchoring him into a plane. This was session 1, and the BBEG wasn't supposed to be attacked in the first place. He was not invited back for another session. F.a.t.a.l. What would happen if you took Oglaf, made it violent, sprinkled in unnecessarily complex higher level maths, and then turned it into a real tabletop RPG system? You'd get F.a.t.a.l, the misogynistic, racist and homophobic uncle of tabletop gaming. It's not even very good. It's overly complicated and takes much of the choice in character creation and randomises it, leading to less planned backstories and role-playing experiences. Infamously though, the game does require you to set a circumference in character creation. I'm sure there are some edgelords out there who love this one. The creators consider it highbrow after all, but for me, it's better left as a quirk in the history of tabletop gaming, rather than a serious system to try out. There are other, edgy, strict violence-based RPGs that actually have workable mechanics if you're desperate for something like this. f.a.t.a.l. I'm not sure what this one refers to, but I'll offer 3 interpretations. 1. It could be a reference to the feat, fell-handed, which essentially gives a user bonuses when using axe-like weapons. 2. This could refer to Adric f.a.t.a.l, a human fighter who leads a group of 5, f.a.t.l.'s 5, in a comic book adventure published by Hasbro. What sets this apart would be the inclusion of things like character sheets in certain versions, and additionally, the attempt to incorporate 4E rules into the comic itself. Loosely, I should add, since sometimes they do play fast and loose. It's certainly like reading a player's story, rather than just a comic book story. 3. Finally, it might refer to Shadowfell, which is essentially the dark counterplane to the Feywild, but rather than being full of magic and fairies, it's full of decay and death. One fun rumour is that the reason it's so dark is because all the light of the place was channeled into a single citadel for the plane, making the shining citadel a bastion of light, though no one has ever found evidence of this. I think the second option, Adric f.a.t.a.l, is the most likely intended meaning, but all 3 are fun to include and why I didn't ask for clarification. Book of Vile Darkness. Totally ignoring the Dungeons & Dragons movie sequel with the same name, which I've already indicated I'd like to avoid, the Book of Vile Darkness only refers to the in-game artifact and in real life sourcebook. The sourcebook is from the 3rd edition and offers mature content with an evil focus to introduce into games, including mechanics surrounding torture and drug use. There are also a variety of classes, spells, items and monsters included. The in-game artifact was initially written by Vecna, transcribing scrolls that fell into his possession, as well as adding his own content. The nature of the book allowed amendments and additions to be made by others later, which made it a bit hodgepodge. It was made from the flesh of a human face and the bones of a demon. Evil spellcaster readers would gain insight and the ability to dominate evil people. Neutral people would be turned evil, and good spellcasters would either be made permanently insane or simply die after reading the book. This is because the book was aware of the reader and could show or hide content at will, or, alternatively, could kill a person and destroy their soul if they saw no hope in the user. The book takes 80 hours to read, and not only has a corrupting effect on those around it, but prevents even plant life from growing. Bottom of the iceberg. This is like the last level, but even players will likely not reach these depths. DMs only from here, I suspect. The Curse of Drannor. Drannor, originally the city of Carmanthor, was once an important community of the Cormanthir, which was one of the Tel-Kasir elven empires. The city was considered a bastion that epitomised high culture, magic, knowledge and civilization. Physically, it had an imposing background with many towers. Those owned by magicians often given the illusion of very strange forms. The city itself was in the shape of a battle-axe head. During the Weeping War, the Army of Darkness defeated the armies of Drannor and overran the city. The defenders caused many casualties, but the sheer numbers sent by the Army of Darkness were overwhelming. As a last-ditched effort to protect the city, Jarok Haladrian gathered surviving bards to his concert hall to try to cast a final protection spell to ward off the Army of Darkness. Right as the spell's crescendo was reached, Hastim the Gentle Rebuke, a powerful Oglaf invader, entered the hall and began causing chaos. This interference caused the spell to backfire, and, as a result, everyone in the hall was petrified. The stone figures of the bards continue to produce the final note of their song to this day, and whilst individuals have tried to attack the figures to stop the scream-like note, going as far as to lop off their heads, they continue their song. Those who enter the hall have a chance of going mad. It is said the casters are still alive in their petrified form, though, if that is the case, they would themselves be completely mad at this point. Warcraft. This is another entry which I wasn't sure on, but rather than ask, I've made a few guesses. This could relate to the inspiration of D&D on games like Warcraft. It's clear D&D had a big impact on a lot of games in the fantasy genre, and there is no reason this would be an exception. However, whilst there are similarities of names, races, etc., I can't find any solid sources on direct parallels that aren't also prevalent in ancient mythology and older fantasy settings, for example, The Lord of the Rings, so I'm not fully sure this is the answer. There are also multiple Warcraft tabletop games, ranging from a game based in the pandemic system to games based on wargaming and even resource management board games. I don't think it's any of these, but there is one called Warcraft the Role-Playing Game, originally Dungeons & Dragons Warcraft the Role-Playing Game, which is effectively a setting based on 3rd edition. I don't think this game would be a major interest to those who aren't interested in the Warcraft series, but for those that are, this game would offer players the opportunity to roleplay in an important setting to them, and, from reviews, it generally seems to do a good job of it. Female treants. I don't know what this one is in reference to at all. I'm worried that it's to do with people producing not suitable for work OC of female treants, and I want no part in that, nor do I want it in my browser history. The only notable fact I could find is that black squirrels feed on the shoots of female treants, which prevents population from getting out of control. If this entry is referring to that, it's certainly a niche tidbit of D&D lore to be aware of, but not, I suspect, the true purpose of this entry. Moving on. Gold box. Before the Infinity Engine, D&D games often use the gold box engine. These games I'm far less familiar with, and I won't butcher them by trying to explain their content in too much detail, but they were the sort of game to appear on the Amiga and other consoles of that era. From what I can tell, they look graphically similar to games like King's Quest, but are top-down with more traditional RPG mechanics. The games seem largely to be based in the Forgotten Realms, though again, I don't want to speak too definitively on these games. They use the AD&D system. To list a few examples of games, there's Belljammer, Pirates of the Realm Space, Forgotten Realms and Limited Adventures, the Pool of Radiance series, and even a Buck Rogers series based on the engine. GIF came from G.R.R. Martin. In the dead of night, Gary Gygax snuck into the home of the then unknown and unpublished G.R.R. Martin during a particularly heavy sleep. Gary looked through George's notebooks until he came across a name to steal: Githyanki. That story is, of course, a complete fabrication. What really happened is that in 1977, George had his first novel published, Dying of the Light, which included a race called the Githyanki. Charles Stross, another author, read the story and included the race name in his homebrew D&D campaign, which was later published in White Dwarf. The lore of this race was eventually incorporated into the game, particularly into Planescape. Unintentional plagiarism? Perhaps, but the races only share a name, not characteristic, and George seems unfazed, so I doubt we'll see any more lawsuits anytime soon. At least not over the Gith. Palace of the Silver Princess. What's so special about this module? It's one aimed at lower level characters, and whilst a good module for starter DMs and enjoyable all around, why do copies sell for thousands of pounds? Well, the version you have probably won't. The original run of this module was published with 2 main pictures that caused issues, which led to a recall and the destruction of thousands of copies. First, there was a drawn scene depicting a woman having her clothes torn off by beasts. In the context of the module, the scene was an illusion to encourage paladins to throw caution to the wind and YOLO into a trap. The image was described as S&M by management when they pulled the authors up in the meeting after the release. Second, and probably the real reason, considering the scene wasn't far from other published content, was that an illustrator had changed Gene Wells' 3-headed giant, or Ubu, into a 3-headed parody where the heads were each a caricature of staff-stroke management at TSR. There is no clear agreement on who it represents, nor do I think management knew either. However, the general impression of defiance led them to take action and recall the module. There was a second printing of the module with offending content removed. The original was orange, and new version green, but as you can probably imagine, the first edition has become a rare collector's item. Elminster told Ed about FR. Remember earlier when we talked about crystal spheres and how every possible reality is encapsulated in a crystal sphere that can, in principle, be accessed with a spelljammer? Well, with that in mind, let's not forget that our reality is a possible reality. The Forgotten Realms, as a setting, is so deep and consistent, it really does seem to be fully fleshed out to a suspiciously high degree. There is a theory that Elminster travels to our reality and tells Ed Greenwood about the Forgotten Realms, which is why we have such a consistent, rich lore to refer to. I won't say much more for now, but I promise you that this entry of the Iceberg will go deeper. Oh. The good old Infinity Engine again, giving us classics like Planescape Torment. In this entry, we have the character O, a minor character from the game and living embodiment of the letter O in the divine alphabet. He appears to be humanoid, though does not breathe, and his body does not match his movements. He appears differently to different people, though all sense something much larger when looking at him. O also appears in the non-D&D game Tides of Numenera. I wonder if he's spelljammed. Or maybe the divine alphabet spans all crystal spheres as part of the luminous being. Perhaps O is nothing more than a part of the illegible scrolls of our DM in that case. Esper Genesis. Published by Alligator Alley Entertainment, Esper Genesis is a sci-fi tabletop RPG based on the 5e system. I've never played Esther, but it looks really interesting. As a third-party game, it seems to come closest to D&D in space that I have seen, and by that I mean classes and mechanics really seem to match vanilla 5e. However, the focus seems to be on additions as a supplement, for example, with ship combat. Spelljammer is apparently coming to 5e though, so maybe this won't last forever. Looking online, I've seen the term space opera thrown around to describe the feel of Esper, so whilst I haven't played it yet, it seems to offer a true D&D 5e experience, whilst also having a Star Wars vibe, which sounds like every nerd's dream. I'm sure I won't be disappointed. It's not like nerds have ever been let down by hype. Beneath the Iceberg. Even my DM hasn't heard of these ones. Stage musical. I'm not 100% sure what this entry refers to, and I'm starting to prefer playing the guessing game rather than asking M. Christopher directly. He's always helpful, but there's an element of interpretation I can play with by inserting my own clearly incorrect theories, though I am sorry for warping your creation, M. Christopher. At D&D Celebration 2021, there was supposedly the first officially endorsed D&D musical called The Circus of Sound, which ran for 2 hours to close out the day's events. This feels like it isn't what is being referred to though, to me at least, as it was one-off, and stage musicals, in my view, are characterised by having repeat performances over a period of time. A one-off musical feels more like a day activity for an audience, rather than something distinct. Here Be Dragons, on the other hand, is a stage musical running in New York, as I wrote the script for this specific entry. 28th of June 2022 is when I wrote this. It's now the 17th of August, so quite some time ago. This musical tells the story of a group of players finishing college and who, through their games of D&D, explore their thoughts and feelings towards the upcoming changes and their future prospects. The issue here is that the announcement for this musical seems to come after Christopher's Iceberg, so I don't know if it's exactly what's being referred to. She Kills Monsters is a stage play about a woman who copes with stress in her life by creating a D&D module. However, this is almost certainly not what is being referred to as a drama, stroke comedy, and not a musical. There are mentions online of other unofficial stage musicals, but I can't find anything concrete, so this entry will remain an ambiguous one with a scattered approach. Anything which sticks to the proverbial wall. Balothemog's true purpose. Thinking back to Elminster's alleged spelljamming antics, wherein Ed Greenwood is nothing but a journalist or historian, why is it that we aren't overrun by demons, devils and monsters looking to do the same thing? There needs to be an in-lore explanation. Balothemog is an alternative name for the Lovecraftian eldritch horror Yog-Sothoth, and is decried as the darkness between the stars. It is Yog-Sothoth that is the guardian force or entity that exists to ensure that nothing in the multiverse can escape to taint the true reality of the outer dimensions. When discussing this one with Christopher, and I admit that last description came directly from him, he very much enjoyed the fact that an eldritch horror is effectively the watchdog against fantasy creatures invading our world, though this does fit in with our earlier understanding of eldritch evil not fully mapping onto moral evil. Although, it is worth noting that if the Balothemog interpretation is the case, and if the Elminster theory is true, how does Elminster do it? Does his power surpass them? Is his energy more ancient than theirs? I might be chatting nonsense at this point, but if Elminster ever pops into your head, please don't try to contemplate his nature too deeply. As Lovecraft would probably say, his nature could be so ancient and ineffable that it goes beyond all comprehension to the point of madness. Elminster could haunt your dreams, and perhaps he already haunts Ed's. Bensozia. Having only appeared in 1E, Bensozia is a relatively niche piece of lore. She was an archdevil queen of hell and consort to Asmodeus. She was murdered by the archdevil, Levistus, which was the reason for his imprisonment. Either because he tried to force himself on her, or because he attempted to sway her loyalties to him and failed. Bensozia was the mother of Glacia, who is featured more prominently in lore as recently as 4E as the daughter of Asmodeus. There is an alternative version of Benzozia's death, told in Dungeon Magazine 197, where Bensozia actually was undermining Asmodeus and providing information to Levistus as his consort. But Levistus also took Glacia, her daughter, as his consort to gain even more advantage over Asmodeus. However, upon discovering the two timing, Glacia killed her mother, and the event was covered up and blamed on Levistus to protect Asmodeus' authority. This version confuses me slightly, as it doesn't make a lot of sense that Asmodeus would hold her in relatively good favour if she had been consorting with an enemy. So the faithful version of Bensozia is, I think, likely the accurate story. Dragonstrike VHS. Dragonstrike is a TSR board game released in 1993. The game has a simplified version of D&D mechanics and included maps, miniatures and quests, which made it a good starting point for young or new players. The key to this section though is the accompanying videotape. The VHS is, simply, a guide for gameplay, given for a live action story with heavy use of special effects. However, for some, it is much more than that. Don Jolly, who has no association with Trigger Happy TV, wrote a blog post about the video, which I think really brings a certain magic to this tape for his long obsession. He points to the weirdness of the video as a contributing factor to his obsession, with multiple questions which could not be answered. Why so much world building in a tutorial video? Why show multiple shots of decapitations in a child-friendly board game iteration of D&D? Why is there a monitor in the video, but not in the game itself? Why are the rules so fast and loose in a tutorial for the game? Don eventually reached out to the video creator, Flint Dial, and had answers to some of the questions. For example, the Minotaur was planned, but omitted due to time restraints. The rules were wonky, because he was using an earlier version when creating it, etc. But excitingly for Don, there was also a planned sequel in outer space, which even had its own trailer. That, I think, also explains much of the effort in the creation of the VHS, and there were apparently plans for a full series at some point. The darkest of depths. Some say that at this level, fact and fiction are unverifiable. M. Christopher has transcended beyond simply having knowledge and become the creator of truth itself. Has he comprehended the eldritch truths of Elminster? Wild Space Series. What do you know? The next entry in this iceberg is about a D&D series set in outer space. Could it be? Yes. The niche Dragonstrike VHS and planned sequel in space, Wild Space, is the next entry of the iceberg. I always enjoy iceberg content where a different layer looks at a familiar topic even more deeply. The Wild Space series was both a sequel to the Dragonstrike VHS as well as a sequel to the Spelljammer setting. The trailer, available on the internet and linked in the description below, shows the same over-the-top campy fun with the same special effects as before. There was a planned board game to go with it, which never released, and 4 novels, of which 1 was published, making it the only Wild Space content to officially release. It was called A Wild Ride and was an Endless Quest gamebook. That in itself is interesting, just to know what could have been and the plans around it. But even further, Wild Space was apparently mostly finished. Don Jolly, after meeting Flint Dial, ended up asking about the sequel, and Dial confirmed that Wild Space made it to post-production, but due to delays, by the time it was nearing completion, people had already moved on to other projects. He describes his last experience of the project as leaving an LA storage room which contained the materials and not seeing any of it since. Those of you interested in lost media may well be salivating, as there could be an entire sequel to the Dragonstrike VHS, set in space, sitting out there somewhere in an LA storage room, waiting to be found. Or, perhaps, it's been destroyed to make space for Friends reruns, or just LA apartments. Only time will tell. Original Human Creator. This entry is self-explanatory. In D&D lore, who is the original human creator? Dwarves are associated with Modron, elves with Corellian, but humans seem to have no specific god associated with them. Is that due to a primacy afforded to humanity? The others somehow being simulacrum races, rather than the original or authentic? Or is it a practical response to avoiding real-world controversy? Lord knows there's been enough. This entry is very specific, and I quote M. Christopher quite heavily, so I again don't want to claim the rest of this entry is from my own research. One answer to the question of an original human creator god in lore is Zarus, who states that a human's worst sin is to produce offspring with a non-human race. He's lawful evil and seemingly racist. Though I say that specifically in the context of D&D, as entities like elves, orcs and dwarves in D&D are not at all comparable to different races of human. I don't want to draw false equivalencies. M. Christopher explained to me a different and much more niche answer though, cobbling together evidence from Dungeon 100, Polyhedron 159 and Dragon 309. Essentially, within Gith lore, it suggests Gith were originally humans that were enslaved by Illithids, then were warped and mutated over time into the yellow creatures they are now. The Illithids themselves in this answer killed the original human creator goddess, Tharagos, who was used in the campaign setting. M. Christopher justified this explanation being applicable to general lore with the fact that Gith are setting neutral and can appear anywhere, and Illithids are known to mess with timelines, so it isn't too far-fetched that Illithids killed the human creator god and turned a portion of humanity into Gith. M. Christopher added that it's even possible that the massive petrified dead corpse, known as the One in the Void, upon which Tinaraf was built, is the original dead human goddess, although that corpse has 6 arms, so only if the god did not create humanity in their image, which is itself very possible. It's an interesting take and a great final entry to this iceberg. Please don't forget to subscribe, this video took a long time to make. As promised at the start, I'll give some ideas on what I'm going to do next, and also ask you, as a new and emerging community, for ideas on what you'd like to see and where you think my strengths might lie. The first thing I'll do is create one more edit of this series where all 3 parts are in a definitive iceberg video. I'll likely remove the intros and outros to keep it to the point for any passing viewers. After that, I intend to work on some deep dives into various topics, though initially with the intention of having 10 to 20 minute videos. I'd like to return to long form videos, but whilst my subscriber count is so low, it might not be best for channel growth. If anyone has an interesting topic you'd like to see me cover, please share them in the comments or in messages to me. I have some ideas myself, though I'll keep those to myself for now. I really do expect to have more regular uploads from here. Shorter videos are easier to script and create, so I'm hoping I'll be less likely to hit motivation issues, and will be able to fit it more easily into the unpredictability of life. You've probably clocked by now that I have an interest in philosophy and literature, and while this channel won't be dedicated to those, there will likely be reference to those where I can squeeze them in. Thank you again to everyone who has supported me. Look out for the full iceberg video, and then, after that, whatever comes next. Bye for now.